Hello and welcome to Global Justice, Biblical Justice A to X. Global is pleased to present this monthly video conference to discuss a range of justice concerns from abortion to xenophobia. My name is Sosamma Samuel-Burnett and I'll be serving as your moderator for this session. If you're joining us in the live audience, I encourage you to turn off your other computer programs so that you have the best audiovisual experience. Well, we're so pleased that you're joining us for this session as we focus on the topic of euthanasia, among our most controversial of justice concerns. And to present on this topic, we have a bioethics expert, Dr. Joy Riley. Welcome, Dr. Riley.
Hi, thank you very much for having me.
Great to have you with us. Dr. Riley, before we get into questions about this session, I want to go ahead and share a little bit about your background with our audience so that they can get a better picture of your background for this topic. So Dr. Joy Riley is both an MD and an MA. She's the executive director of the Tennessee Center for Bioethics and Culture, and she serves as an ethics consultant of a Nashville area hospital. She's board certified in internal medicine, and her writing and lecture topics include medical ethics, organ transplantation ethics, stem cell research, genetics, and assisted reproductive technologies. Her educational background includes the University of Louisville for her undergraduate work and the University of Kentucky for her medical school. In addition, she has worked with Washington University in Missouri, both with Jewish Hospital and also in research. She's gone on to work in the emergency room, among other experiences, and has also worked in the area of aging and geriatrics. In addition, Dr. Riley has been an author. Along with Scott B. Ray, she co-authored Outside the Womb, Moral Guidance for Assisted Reproduction, as well as with C. Ben Mitchell, Christian Bioethics, a guide for pastors, healthcare professionals, and families. Welcome again, Dr. Riley.
Thank you.
Well, let's kind of jump right to our topic. As you know, this series is really about looking at justice concerns from a biblical perspective, and this concern of euthanasia is something that maybe not everyone completely understands. So let's sort of set it in a framework, if we could. Would you talk to us a little bit about what is euthanasia, what are some of the things our audience needs to know, and how do we distinguish some of the subtopics that we might come up on in this session?
Oh, great question. Euthanasia is from the Greek words which mean good death. And in our world, in our experience, there is some conflation of terms, but one term you need to be aware of, or the differentiation of terms, include, first of all, physician-assisted suicide. And that is typically when a patient requests either, well, usually it's a prescription for medicine, and that is to end their lives. And the physician doesn't give them the medication, but gives the prescription. Excuse me. Active euthanasia is when a physician, or, oh, well, I guess a nurse could do this as well, gives a patient a lethal dose of medicines to end that person's life. Then there are three kinds of active euthanasia. One is voluntary, and that is that the patient has requested this. The patient has requested to be killed. Non-voluntary means that the person killed did not request it, nor did they give consent. And then finally, involuntary is when the patient specifically requested not to be killed and is killed anyway.
You know, that's very helpful. Thank you for sharing those distinctions. You know, I think it's important for our audience to know that euthanasia more broadly is generally outlawed in most countries. But this topic of physician-assisted suicide has come up under different types of legal, terms and statutes. Different laws have been passed in various communities, various states. Why do you think that physician-assisted suicide, for example, has become a more prominent issue in recent years?
Well, I think several reasons. I think that one of the major reasons is that people are often fearful, and groups and persons who support physician-assisted suicide often, quite frankly, play on those fears. And we're told that it would be horrible to reach the end of your life and want to be able to procure medication to end your life and not be allowed to do that. And so we should give people the right to kill themselves. Mm-hmm. Well, there is no right to kill yourself, but there is also no one stands in your way if you commit suicide typically, except those who usually love you and want you not to commit suicide. Mm-hmm. But the projection is for physician-assisted suicide is it's for the patient's right to be killed. But physician-assisted suicide does not give a patient a right to be killed. It gives a doctor the right to kill. And people don't understand that.
You know, it's really interesting that you clarified that, and you've worked with, you know, an aging population in your, you know, background, and, you know, end-of-life issues are very serious issues. How do you sort of distinguish some of these, you know, current controversies over this topic and just general end-of-life concerns or you know, areas that you've generally been working with?
End-of-life concerns typically include things like people don't want to be in pain. People want to usually be able to say goodbye to their loved ones, and they're worried about suffering. So the things that we need to do as a society and as health practitioners specifically is to help people understand that we will do our best to help them not to be in pain, to help them in their suffering, not to end their suffering, but to help them by killing them, but to be present with them in their suffering and ease it as much as possible. So we need to encourage our family members and friends to take advantage of palliative care medicine, whereby people can be helped with their pain and their distress. And you don't have to have a terminal diagnosis to have palliation, okay? So that's an important distinction.
Sure, that's a very important point, and I think a lot of times when people hear about things like physician-assisted suicide and that type of thing, they have seen it under the umbrella of sort of a compassionate choice, but it seems like the reality is that may not be compassionate. The more compassionate would be these palliative types of services. Would you agree with that?
Oh, very much so. Compassion actually means to suffer with. And a misapplication of compassion is to put someone else out of your misery. Indeed, the public is not aware, perhaps, of the fact that the current group called Compassion and Choices originally was called the Hemlock Society, which is, of course, named after the poison that Socrates was required to drink.
Yeah, and I think it's important for people to know that sometimes the marketing of these terms doesn't necessarily take away the grave, you know, issues that are involved in these decisions. I want to actually broaden our conversation a little bit and sort of talk about it from a biblical or philosophical or ethics perspective. You know, you are a bioethics expert, so frame this for me. Why are these types of topics, you know, euthanasia more broadly, physician-assisted suicide, mercy killings, these other types of terminologies, such a big concern under this sort of broad biblical justice umbrella?
Well, some of that depends on the definition of justice. Many people will, especially in the healthcare field, will primarily navigate toward Rawls's definition of justice, which is fairness. But that quite frankly is an anemic view of justice, because justice really means talking about what the other person, what we need to give the other person the just desserts, what they really deserve, and as certainly as fellow humans, they deserve, I think, to be treated well, to be treated with dignity, and that doesn't mean ending their life, but it means to come alongside them. And that's what true compassion is. So I think it's a misapplication of the words compassion and the word justice. The Jewish concept of justice, or shalom, actually is related, is a beautiful one, and it means not only peace with God, peace within the community, but it's also peace within yourself. And that's a good description, and that's something we should really, I think, yearn for and work toward.
Oh, that's great. You know, and I think that's important for us to understand. You know, certainly life and death issues are concerns for justice, but I think from a biblical and ethics standpoint, you know, we're also asking ourselves why. Why is that a concern? You know, and what are the deeper reasons for having that kind of concern for life and death? And I think, you know, what you shared in terms of the Jewish tradition, it certainly is part of that, is really understanding how we relate to one another and how we value one another as human beings. I appreciate you sharing that. I also wanted to talk a little bit about, the global perspective. As you know, global justice works on justice issues around the globe, and issues of euthanasia are not limited to here in the United States. And would you speak a little bit to, what you think are some of the more broad, international concerns on this topic?
Well, certainly. There are a number of nation states around the world who have approved euthanasia, and the first was the Netherlands in 2001. Belgium followed shortly thereafter in 2002. Luxembourg followed. Several states in the U.S. have physician-assisted suicide as differentiated from euthanasia. But there are several if you will, ethical problems with euthanasia in terms of justice issues. One part of justice is to treat other people fairly. And if you're living in community, how do you treat each other fairly? There are several things that are across the board, usually desired qualities. And one is truth-telling. We expect to tell the truth. If you live next door to someone who is a perennial liar, then you don't... if you fail to trust what they say, it frays the societal fabric. If you live next door to a murderer, it frays it even more. It makes huge holes in the social fabric. In the U.S., at least, in many of the states that have had, they're not that many, but the ones who have passed physician-assisted suicide laws, often the provision is that the physician cannot say on the death certificate that the person died from physician-assisted suicide. They have to list something else as a cause of death. So you're requiring physicians to lie. So are causing people not to tell the truth, or you're requiring them by law to not tell the truth. So you are not only licensing physicians to kill, you're telling them also to lie about it. So no society can really function for very long if you have people all about you who are lying and who are murdering or who are killing people. So that is a total fraying of society. In the Netherlands, in 2016, the Minister for Health and Sport basically came out and said, as an arm of the government, said that people who view their life as complete should be able to die with dignity, should be able to be euthanized. And so you see this slippery slope that includes more and more people, not just people who are terminally ill, but now by 2016, so you're going from 2002 when it was legalized in the Netherlands, or excuse me, 2001, to 2016, the government is now saying, if you're just tired of life, if you view your life as complete, you can request euthanasia. Well, as recently as 2002, the World Medical Association reaffirmed that euthanasia was contrary to the ethical principles of medicine. But in the UK, you have Baroness Warnock, who was in charge of the Warnock Committee regarding assisted reproductive technologies after the birth of Louise Joy Brown, the world's first test tube baby. Well, and recently, well, actually it was 2008, Baroness Warnock came out publicly, actually in a Norwegian publication, but she also had interviews in the UK press, saying that people with dementia should kill themselves because they were a burden to the National Health Service and to their families. So you have the right to die. Because if you enact that in law, it doesn't stay the right to die. It becomes the duty to die.
That's really interesting, and especially when we're thinking about the sort of the ethics basis behind these. One of the concerns, as you mentioned, is there's this inherent lie that you have to create because you can't say it's physician-assisted suicide in those instances. But then you have this other thing, which is who's choosing for you, who's designating who should, who's creating the duty. It's not necessarily coming from the individual, it's coming basically, in this case, from the government, right? And that creates a whole set of ethical concerns, and I'm wondering if you could speak a little further on that.
Well, you're talking about coercion. And people can be coerced on a variety of levels. Physicians in the U.S. are being coerced to lie. Some could be at least influenced and potentially coerced to take part in physician-assisted suicide. In other places, the Belgian group of intensive care physicians a few years ago, I think it was 2014, published a paper saying that when they decided that a person could be euthanized, that it should be a team decision, but once that decision was made, every member of the team was expected to enact that plan. That's, again, coercion. Baroness Warnock is talking about people with Alzheimer's or other dementias should kill themselves. That is a public pressure, which can become coercion. A friend and a mentor of mine actually said that if someone is close enough to have an interest, they're close enough to have an interest, meaning they may have an interest in your will, in your legacy, so that they might be very interested in your death. So when you enact these sorts of laws, it's not clear when your family member or a friend seems to be expressing concern. You might not be so sure that their concern is for your welfare. Their concern may be for your demise.
Well, and there was a case not too long ago of a young man who actually went to court because he had these aged parents with severe health concerns, and he was basically trying to advocate for euthanizing them because of the financial burden for him. In taking care of them, and I found that to be a pretty shocking, premise. But I suppose that's not as uncommon as we might think because of what you just shared. Just a related topic. When you talk about coercion, it's also the sense of conscience. So if you were a staff member, any part of the medical team, and if the law, basically requires you to act on behalf of this, method, you would have to follow along, even though it might be against your personal conscience. Is that the case in these legal frameworks?
Well, I'm not sure that in the U.S. you would be jailed yet, but there should be a right of conscience. There has been a right of conscience for physicians, but it isn't always recognized or endorsed. But if you think about it, euthanasia is an elective procedure. So why should I have my license on the line for not participating in an elective procedure? There is no case where it's an emergency that you need to put someone down, to cause someone's life to be ended. So, so you're really when it comes up against it, you're positing an elective procedure against a lifetime of training and expertise. It doesn't seem a very fair position.
Certainly, and that definitely raises the professional ethic behind this. As a medical professional, you take the Hippocratic Oath, correct? And how does this fit in with that oath that a medical professional takes?
Well, that's a whole nother conversation. The Hippocratic Oath originally did state that you would not give a poison to anyone even if asked to do so. The oath has been widespread, but it has also been watered down in its content. So you don't always promise that. But I think it's important to know what your physician's about. Do you mind if I tell you a story?
Oh, certainly.
A friend of mine is a colleague. He lives in Canada now. He's a Brit. He has practiced medicine in the UK, in Jamaica, and in Rwanda. A lot of feeding of people who have been in war, particularly in Rwanda. But at any rate, he is very concerned about this, and he began the Hippocratic Registry of Physicians. And they use the real caduceus, which is the one snake around the rod of Asclepius. And that's as opposed to the other caduceus, which is not the medical symbol. The wings on the snake, or the wings on that staff, that's Mercury. And that's the god of businessmen and thieves, quite frankly. And it's also the god of travelers and the guide of souls to the underworld. Well, Dr. Patrick uses the correct caduceus. on his pen, and on the first day that he had put his pen on his lapel, he went to his bank to conduct some business. He had known the tellers for years, and one teller says, "Excuse me, what is that pin you're wearing? What is that thing?" And he said, "It means I won't kill you."
Oh my goodness.
And so he's a consummate teacher, so he proceeded to teach her the difference between Hippocratic medicine and other kinds. And so physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia turns the caduceus of medicine into the symbol for Mercury, the guide to the souls, the guide of souls to the underworld. That's not why I went to medical school.
Well, and I would assume that probably is not the case for most people that go to medical school. But, you know, there is this thinking that happens in our society about mercy killings, you know, this idea that, you know, we're being merciful when someone is suffering. And so in that respect, you know, perhaps that's you know, a more, you know, again, if you're using the term compassionate, you know, methodology. So how do you address that idea of being merciful, you know, through these types of measures?
I have been trained as an internal medicine physician, and I worked, as you said, in a nursing home at one point. I've seen a lot of people that were nearing their deaths. I have sat and I've held some hands. I have sat quietly nearby. I've been with family. I've called family to let them know that their loved one is getting worse. And to me, those are acts of mercy. And I've never given drugs to make someone die. I don't see that as an act of mercy. I see that as having incredible consequences. Who am I to decide that their time to reconcile with their neighbor, with their family, with their God? Who am I to say that that time is finished?
Right.
That really isn't my decision.
Oh, absolutely. You know, there is this, you know, incredible tension in our society about this idea of suffering, and that's kind of a related topic we can maybe touch on today. That there tends to be this idea that we shouldn't suffer. But suffering is not certainly something that the Bible says that we shouldn't do. You know, there's definitely suffering, you know, biblically speaking. And so could you maybe touch on that a little bit, about that biblical perspective on suffering and our society's idea that, you know, that people shouldn't suffer?
I think C.S. Lewis gives us a wonderful picture of this in his book, The Problem of Pain. He talks about A pain and B pain. And A pain is something that we all have sometimes. If I accidentally slice my thumb while I'm cutting vegetables or something, that's pain. And that's A pain. I can usually bandage that or take some medication to maybe take the edge off, and sometimes to not only dull the pain but get rid of it. But the pain of a broken relationship, the pain of anticipating suffering, that's a B-type pain in Lewis's parlance. And painkillers don't work for that. If you look at people who request physician-assisted suicide, our culture is told over and over and over again that they are afraid of pain. That is not the reason people request it. If you look at the data, it's not for fear of pain. It's more fear of loss of control. And, you know, for any of us who think we're in control, all you need to do is think back, if you have children, to when they were toddlers. How well did we control them then? So control is a castle in the air. We don't have a lot of it. So it behooves us to contemplate how we want to have our lives end. We don't even have control over that, but we can at least do our part between now and then to be reconciled to those with whom we need to reconcile, to get the jobs done we need to do. And then sometimes it's to wait.
Interesting. And, you know, it's interesting how you phrase that, because then the appropriate term really is suicide. You know, it isn't, you know, a merciful thing. It isn't really a compassionate choice. It really is suicide, someone making the choice to end their life for whatever reasons. And so that, I think, raises a whole spectrum of concerns in our society when we think about the growth and expansion of suicide in general, and then now in this more medical context. So I appreciate what you shared about that. I want to also allow a little bit of time to share a little bit about your current work, because this is a field that you touch on at the center. The center covers a number of different bioethics topics. If you could share a little bit about the work at the center and maybe a current project or program that you're presently working on.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. We're a 501c3 educational corporation, and so our job is basically to promote human dignity from conception to natural death, and we do that through a variety of ways. We send out, we have electronic newsletters. We don't do hard copies, and so we send out a monthly e-newsletter on a variety of topics, be it physician-assisted suicide, the more recent synthetic embryo-like beings that are called sheaths, to assisted reproductive technologies. And one thing I'm really excited about is that we have an art lending program for colleges and universities. It was a small collection, but it's a series of 3. The pieces were all done by a sculptress named Karen Swinholt. And they're ways they're to be displayed in colleges and universities, like I said, usually like in the library or someplace that the students frequent. Hopefully it's a library. But at any rate, and they address different bioethics issues. So we have Adam creating himself about the ways in which we try to manufacture ourselves. We have the little fool, which is one who feels bound to his circumstances, to his life or whatever, and he wants to free himself. So his feet are like roots, and those are the things that bind him. So he has a machete in his hand to free himself. And then thirdly and last is the Rubicon. The Rubicon is a picture of the small stream in northern Italy, not too far from Rome. When Pompey was in power, there was a law that said that any general who led his army across the Rubicon was committing treason, and so the sentence was death. Julius Caesar knew that rule, but he led his army across the Rubicon and attacked Pompey and defeated him, and he became Caesar. A ruler, not just Julius Caesar. At any rate, so the Rubicon is a symbol of decisions that we make in life that can have far-reaching consequences, and they're points of no return. So that's the third and last piece of art that goes in our traveling exhibit.
Well, I sure hope that comes to Colorado. It sounds like a fascinating exhibit. And I also want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about your books. You had specifically written on Christian bioethics, and I just wanted to sort of ask you, what prompted you to write that? What makes it useful for the average Christian, to understand this sort of bioethics realm?
Well, the first book with Scott Ray called Outside the Womb was written to help people who had struggled or are struggling with assisted reproductive technologies, because a lot of people are rather sucked into the system, and they haven't necessarily given ample consideration to the possibilities. And so that's the reason we have hundreds of thousands of frozen embryos in this country that are still frozen and waiting to be thawed and transferred to a womb. Then the second book with Stephen Mitchell on Christian bioethics, it was written because I had this idea about Michelangelo's David being a representative, to some degree, of what it means to be human. Just looking at that. Granted, he's stone, he is marble. But he's a wonderful analogy, I guess, or an allegory of what it means to be human in some ways. And so I had developed this presentation about chiseling away at David, how we're trying to change David if we take him as an analogy for human beings. And the B&H publishers were pleased about that idea, and so Dr. Mitchell and I wrote a book. It came out differently. We didn't really deal much with David in the book. I'm not sure we even mentioned his name, but at any rate, we wanted to help people think through the conundrum that you face. And every single one of us faces bioethics conundrum, whether it's assisted reproductive technologies, assisted suicide, aging, end-of-life care, so a variety of topics. And we wanted to make it accessible for anyone to pick up and read.
Well, and I encourage our audience to pick up either or both of these books for your reference as well. Dr. Joy Riley, I want to thank you so much for being our guest today on Biblical Justice A to X, especially on this topic of euthanasia. We really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the time.
Well, and to our audience, I want to also thank you for joining us for this session, and we hope you'll join us online when we'll be sharing the broadcast recording as well as a related video guide. The video guide includes not only a summary of our discussion today, but also discussion questions so you can continue the dialogue on this important topic. And we hope you'll join us again next month for the next Biblical Justice A to X. Thank you.